Hello and welcome. I'm Al Barrows, and this is UFO Disclosure, the podcast that's meant to show all the UFO, UAP news from everywhere and anywhere. Today, I'd like to talk about Leah Haley. She's an abductee that very conservative background, but when she finally came out and told her story, she lost everything: her family, her job, um, her reputation. So I kind of became enamored with her and her story. I'd like to talk about that a little bit, if I may. And this is taken from the Cyber Times. I should mention that this New York Times article is actually the first New York Times article that spoke about aliens or any sort of UFO related topic. I know that the 2017 article of the Tic Tac that Blumenthal wrote is very famous for being the first UFO related article that the New York Times wrote. But this is actually the first one, and this was written back in 1997, July the 5th, 1997, and it's entitled Abductees Search for a Little Respect. And it's written by Matt Richel. And it was written in Roswell, New Mexico. And I'll just read. It's a very short article. Leah A. Haley lost her job, her house, and her husband. Neither of her daughters call on Mother's Day, and when the eldest of the two gets married late this summer, Haley will not be invited. The 46-year-old Tennessee accountant wears a scarlet letter A. It stands for alien abduction. Thought that was kind of clever. Whether or not it can be borne out scientifically, Haley believes she has been abducted and examined by aliens. It is a story she tells with passion and sincerity, and I'll be showing her in a video pretty soon. And one she said she has a duty to share with the world in spite of the sacrifice. She's quoted as saying, "It's not their fault. I understand they're embarrassed," Haley said of her family, choking back tears. "It's the media's fault for making abductees look such fools," end quote. The skepticism is well known to John E. Mack, a psychiatrist who nearly lost his position at Harvard University when he began speaking out about his belief in the abduction stories. Mack, who I covered in my last podcast, has since become the most mainstream advocate. This is an article written in 1997, mind you. John Mack has since then passed away. But this article says that he became the most mainstream advocate of the abduction phenomenon. Aliens appear generally interested in reproductive matters, according to Bud Hopkins, who's also a very famous ufologist. He's the author of Missing Time and one of the researchers and most respected among alien abductee believers. Hopkins, 66, an accomplished artist from New York City, has spoken with more than 600 people who have told him of their alleged abductions. He said the ranks include psychiatrists, professionals, and scientists who are too embarrassed to come forward to speak the truth. Like Haley, the sincere, articulate Hopkins clearly believes these stories are true and that in many cases no other explanation is viable. He disregards criticism that the hypnosis used to elicit memories of abduction is not valid. Remember, in my last podcast, I questioned whether hypnosis is a valid form of retrieving memories from abduction victims. As for Haley, though, the abductee, she grew up in a Southern Baptist family in Alabama. She earned a bachelor's degree and secondary education from the University of Alabama and a master's degree in the same field from the University of North Alabama. She later went back to school upon deciding she had an interest in accounting and earned a second master's degree in business administration. In 1990, her world was set. She worked as a CPA and lived with her husband and two teenage daughters in a $250,000 house in Columbus, Mississippi. She's quoted as saying, "I was active in the church, active in the PTA." Haley said it was the all-American home and I loved it. But then there was a plot twist. While visiting her mother in Alabama, Haley said she recalled that when she and her brother were younger, they had seen something outside their home. Her brother recalled the same thing, and the discussion that then triggered other much more painful memories. She said she remembered that in the late 1970s or early 1980s, she was in her late 20s, she had been abducted. She's quoted as saying, I was on a spacecraft in a round room. It was permeated by light," she said. "I was lying flat on my back on an examination table. They were off-white colored aliens with big black almond-shaped eyes, two holes for a nose, no hair, no ears, all the same size." Haley said she used hypnosis to help evoke the memories and that she began having other abduction experiences. She said she resisted believing the experiences, even visiting a psychiatrist, psychologist, and psychotherapist to address what was diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Then in 1991, she said she had an experience that proved to her what was happening. She said she was abducted by members of the U.S. military and interrogated. Okay, folks, that falls right in line with what Dr. Stephen Greer is saying, that the military is involved in these abductions. Haley goes on to be quoted as saying, "They told me not to tell anybody what was happening to me." Haley said, "They told me they would kill me." Still, Haley said she felt no choice but to speak out. In 1992, she published her book, Lost Was the Key, which details her experiences. She also wrote Cito's New Friends, an illustration children's book about a couple of children who were abducted by friendly aliens. She said she kind of went soft in there, she said, explaining that she left some of the horrible details out of the children's book so it would not upset them. She said she often has people thank her for speaking out and telling her their own stories. She said just wishes they would join her. More people have to have the guts to come forward, she said, to prevent the ridicule. Haley said the price is very high, but that's the only way to put this to a stop. I thought the best way to show why I became so interested in Leah Haley and her story is to show you a video of her and show how believable she is and what a fine, open, and trusting person she appears to be. And I believe that's who she really is.
Prior to 1990, I led a relatively normal life, just minding my own business, teaching accounting courses at a local university, and I was a certified public accountant, not practicing at the time, but just teaching accounting courses. Had two very active teenage daughters, happily married, and attending Southern Baptist Church and doing a lot of school and community activities. Never really thought about the UFO subject until July of 1990. I took a weekend break and went up to my parents' house for a visit, and my mother and I were sitting at her kitchen table just eating breakfast and talking about everyday things when my mother read an article in the newspaper, her local newspaper, that stated that the Russian government had just admitted the existence of UFOs. And we started talking about whether extraterrestrials could exist, and my mother said that she just didn't believe that there were any entities other than us. And I started debating the issue. And then I remembered that my brother and a friend and I saw a spacecraft when we were all children. And I asked my mother if she remembered that day, and and she said, yeah, I do, but I think probably what you saw was a weather balloon or a satellite or something like that. Well, my mother didn't see the object, so she said, well, your brother's coming over for a visit in a little while. I'll just ask him if he remembers seeing anything that day. Well, my brother soon came into the kitchen, too, and I said to him, Seth, do you remember seeing that object that we thought was a flying saucer when we were kids? And he said, oh, yeah, how could I ever forget that? And so I asked him what he remembered about that day, and he remembered the same thing I did. He remembered seeing an object that was silver in color, spherical in shape. It was sitting stationary in the sky to the north of us, and it sat there for a long time. It was in the afternoon. The sky was blue, white clouds, a sunny day, and every once in a while the sun would shine on the object such that it looked bluish, sometimes bluish in color, most of the time silver. We watched it for a long time, and then it looked as if it floated down into the woods nearby to the east, and we went and looked for the object. We thought that we'd like to see if it was a spaceship. We called them flying saucers back then. It was a long time ago. But we went into the woods looking for the object and came back out very disappointed that we hadn't found it. When I remembered this incident in 1990, my brother and I commented on how unusual it was, how strange it was that we never talked about it. For 30 years we never talked about that incident, yet looking back it seemed to be one of the most important days in our lives. But then I asked my brother if he thought what we had seen that day really was a spaceship. And he said yes. And I said, why do you think so? And he said, well, I've seen quite a few TV shows about spaceships and extraterrestrials and seen a lot of, and he said, in fact, I've seen some talk shows wherein their people claim to have been abducted. And he said in some cases they remember the incidents as dreams, but then they undergo hypnotic regression and they discover that the incident was real and that there are more details they remember under hypnosis that they could not remember consciously. When he said the word dream, I remembered an incident that occurred to me in the late 70s or early 80s. I lived in Florence, Alabama at that time, and one morning I woke up and walked into the kitchen to get a drink of water and remembered that during the night I had been aboard a spacecraft. How I knew it was a spacecraft, I don't know. I didn't know then how I knew that, but I knew that I was in a round room that was extremely bright, and I remembered chalky colored creatures with big, huge, black, almond-shaped eyes performing medical procedures on me. I couldn't remember what kind of procedures they performed, I just remembered that it was done. And when I remembered that, I thought, oh, wait a minute, this had to have been a dream. There's no way in the world that entities could get in the house, and there's no way that a spaceship could get in the neighborhood without all the neighbors seeing it, and there's no way that I could have gotten out of the bedroom without my husband waking up and discovering my being gone. So this could not have happened. It had to have been a dream. There's no other logical explanation for it. I never heard about abductions back then in the 70s or 80s, so I didn't know they occurred. So then I said to myself, though, but why does this seem so real? It didn't seem like a dream. It seemed that I was really there in this round room with entities all around me performing medical exam. Why does it seem so real if it wasn't? But then I thought, again, well, no, it can't be real. It's impossible. Things like this just don't happen. And then I thought, well, the entities couldn't get into the house. All the doors and windows are locked. And then I thought, well, they are locked, aren't they? Just maybe this did happen and a door window wasn't locked. So I walked around the house and physically checked all the doors and windows, and they were indeed locked. So I told myself that it had to have been a dream. It's the only thing it could have been, that things like that just couldn't happen. Having the idea of whether this was real or not. Besides, I was too busy to mess with it at the time, I thought. I was attending graduate school, working on my master's in business administration, working full-time, had 2 active teenagers, and had just started having a house built. So I didn't have time to mess with nonsense like that, I thought. But all of a sudden, the idea of my having been abducted, of this incident having been real, these ideas just wouldn't go out of my head. And to make it worse, I started having flashbacks of seeing these chalky-colored creatures with big black eyes. Every time I would look in the mirror to put on my makeup or brush my hair or brush my teeth, I would see visions of these entities staring back at me, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And I started being afraid. I thought, you know, if this happened to me, if it really did happen to me, what if it happens again? What if they come back? What if they're hiding in my house when I go to bed at night? And I got scared. I started looking under the beds and in the closets and all the rooms before I go to bed at night. But sometimes it seemed that cars were following me that were of other colors, and this unnerved me somewhat. I didn't know why all of a sudden I was being followed. I noticed that I started having odd noises on my telephone, sometimes music, sometimes beeping sounds, sometimes buzzing in the background, sometimes it sounded as if a cassette tape were winding around in a cassette recorder. Sometimes I would hear voices over the line. I'd never had those things occur before I wrote to Bud Hopkins asking for help. And I never had these things happen before I discussed this possible abduction of 1990. I woke up one morning above my bed, not in it, and I felt that I was awake, that it was really something that happened, that it wasn't a dream, but I had no explanation for it. I also remember being in a beam of light. I was lying horizontally in a beam of light. But after it happened, I thought, this is weird. Something's wrong with me. I'm going crazy. Things like this just can't happen. Not too long after that, I got some information from Bud Hopkins. There was one article or one little publication that talked about the pros and cons of hypnotic regression to examine whether a person has had alien abductions or not. And then there was another little bulletin that he sent that seemed to be a series of articles written by researchers. Well, I tossed that one aside and didn't read it immediately. And it was a couple of months later that I finally read it. And when I did read it, I noticed an article in there about an abductee, an alien abductee, lying above her bed and dropping down onto her waterbed. And when I read that, I just about went berserk, because I thought, gosh, this woman is an alien abductee, and she's had an encounter like the experience I remembered a couple of months note. And the man's name was John Carpenter. He is now the Director of Abduction Research for the Mutual UFO Network. And I called him and told him what I've just said, told him everything that had happened to me that I remembered, and asked him if he could help me find out whether or not this incident I recalled was a dream, or whether it was a real event, or whether I was just going crazy. When I found out he was a psychotherapist, that convinced me that I should go see him. I really thought that perhaps I had gone insane. I was having all these weird flashbacks of alien creatures, and I thought maybe I'm just paranoid about people following me. So I thought maybe I was crazy. Whatever the answer was, I wanted to find out whether my incident I recalled was a dream, or whether it was a real event, or whether I was going crazy. I wanted to know so I could deal with the problem as it needed to be dealt with. So I made an appointment with John Carpenter Wright and I was walking through the woods looking for this flying saucer that we thought had landed there, but I didn't find the flying saucer. What I saw was a chalky colored creature standing in front of a big tree. And I remembered in the hypnosis session being frightened when I saw him. And I remembered that with his big black eyes, he talked to me and told me not to be afraid. And I remembered he took me by the hand, and there's a lapse in memory at that point. The next thing I remembered was being in a different part of the woods, and in a clearing I could see this spaceship, this spherical spaceship, just hovering above the ground. And I remembered that a beam of white light just came down upon the entity and me, beamed us somehow aboard the craft. I remember being in the light, and then the next memory I have is being aboard the craft, lying on a platform with other entities, the same height, same shape. They looked identical to the one I saw in the woods. They were standing around me, poking my arms and legs. And then the next thing I remembered about that incident was being back at the edge of the woods, joining the others, and we all walked out of the woods disappointed we hadn't seen anything. I didn't remember seeing anything. I saw the spherical object hovering in the air, and again a beam of white light took me aboard, and I lay on a platform while identical looking creatures performed gynecological type procedures on me. I remembered that some tissue samples were taken from the vaginal area. I remembered that a needle was inserted through the abdominal wall into the ovary and ova extracted. And I remembered that there was one entity on the other side of the room who was doing something with what was very similar to test tubes. I don't remember a whole lot other than, oh yeah, I remembered something being done to my right ear. I felt what seemed to be a piercing sensation and pain in two places, right behind my ear and deep inside my ear. And I believe that's all I could recall, even under regression, about the first incident. Well, when I came out of hypnosis, I denied being hypnotized. At that point in time, I wanted John Carpenter to tell me I was crazy. I felt that it would be easier to feel that I was insane, easier for me to believe that I was mentally ill, so I could just be put into a mental institution, get proper treatment, get well. And at the same time, I kept thinking to myself, well, if these incidents did happen, I want them to happen again. I want these entities to come back because I want to learn about them. I want to know where they're from. I want to know if they're like us. I want to know why they did what they did. I want answers, and I want them right now. So despite the fact that I'm a little bit afraid, I want them to come back so I can find out what's going on, if this really is occurring. Through the morning, okay, but then at lunchtime, and everybody left the building where I worked. I taught at a university, and at lunchtime, the whole building shut down. We had no classes from noon until 1 o'clock in the building where I worked, and everybody left for lunch, and I did the same thing. And I ran through a drive-through, got a cheeseburger, came back to work, and decided I would grade papers while everyone else was gone, and then I could get a lot done. But as soon as I got my cheeseburger, came back into the building, something compelled me to go to my car and get a letter that I had left in there. And so when I walked outside, I noticed that there was a man sniffing around my car. I got a real good look at him. He had on a long sleeve blue Oxford cloth shirt and gray slacks. He wore glasses. He had on a tie. and he was messing around my car. And I stood there for a few minutes and thought, what's this guy doing? Is he about to steal my car? And I don't know what a car thief looks like, but my mind said, well, he's not a car thief. He's dressed too nicely to be a car thief. And what is it that he's doing? Well, in a few seconds, he caught sight of me, and he looked at me, and then he walked around my car and started looking as if he was poking around in the grass. Find out who the man is and where he works. And he works for a company that does contract work for NASA. And the company he works for is responsible for calibrating the equipment related to the space shuttle's external tanks. And in the meantime,
Okay, so there's evidence that NASA-related agents are following her, keeping tabs on Leah.
I got that information, there were some other strange things that happened to me. I moved into my new house that I had built, and I came home from work one day and found the exterior doors had been loosened in my new home. We had an elaborate security system put into the house, and it kept malfunctioning. And the security people came out practically daily for a couple of months and were extremely exasperated because they couldn't figure out why the memory in my security system was being erased.
So you got to wonder, was it aliens or was it the military that was messing with Leah?
And also, my husband came home from work one day and told me that the FBI was snooping around the hospital where he worked, asking questions about him. One of the employees told him about it. So I started thinking about this. I thought, okay, now, why all of a sudden is the FBI interested in my husband? And why did this man who works for a company that does subcontract work for NASA messing around my car, just all of a sudden, right after I have had hypnosis sessions about abductions by extraterrestrials? Well, I started thinking, okay, you know, this phenomenon must be real. I must have been abducted because I can't see any other reason why these other strange things would be happening. And I must not be insane. The FBI wouldn't be interested in my insanity. The man who worked for a company that does contract work for NASA would not be interested in my insanity, but would they possibly be interested in my contact with extraterrestrials or whatever beings these are? Yes, that made sense. That made sense. That's the point in time where I started accepting the reality of my encounters. This was an invitation to view the Space Shuttle Endeavour. One night I was teaching an accounting course at the local Air Force base. The university where I taught had a contract to teach X amount of courses at the Air Force base, and I was teaching.
So that's interesting that she was teaching at an Air Force base, which put her directly in contact with Air Force agents and even NASA agents, I would assume. That's possibly how they became aware of Leah and how she possibly became one of their subjects.
One of the accounting courses out there. And the last night of lectures, the week before final exams, I was given a lecture in accounting, and at the end of the night, when all the students were leaving, one of my adult female students approached my desk and handed me something. And she said to me, my husband said to give this to you. And I looked at what she gave me, and it looked like some kind of a patch, and I said, what is this? And she said, it's a patch of the Space Shuttle Endeavour. And I said, okay, why did your husband send this to me? And she said, I don't know, he just told me to give it to you. Well, and I started driving home, and I thought, what does this mean? This is a message of some kind. You know, why is this woman's husband, who I later learned was a captain in the Air Force, why was he sending me a patch the Space Shuttle Endeavour. So when I got home that night, I looked up the phone number of this woman, and I called her husband and said, "Thank you for sending me the patch of the Space Shuttle Endeavour, but I'm rather curious, why did you do it?" And he said to me, "Well, my wife has enjoyed your accounting class so much, I just wanted to give you a token of our appreciation." And I was thinking in my head, this is a bunch of garbage. This woman does not like my accounting course that much, not on base. And he said, "The Space Shuttle Endeavour is going to be on base tomorrow. I'd like to take you to see it." And he said, "Now don't tell anyone that this invitation is being extended to you. Don't tell anyone you're going out there. This invitation is for you alone. And make sure you bring your camera. I'll make sure that you get some excellent pictures of this shuttle." Well, I thought that this was a setup, and it frightened me a lot. And I was too scared to go out there. So and I made up some excuses. I told him, I told him the truth. I was tied up giving final exams the next day. Door in the back of the room, a man in an Air Force blue uniform, and he motioned for me to come out into the hall. And I did, and I looked at his name badge and noticed that this was the name of the man who had called me to invite me to go out and view the shuttle. So when I walked out into the hall and saw his name, he didn't even greet me. He said to me, let's go right now." And I said, "Go where?" He said, "To see the space shuttle. I told you I'd take you to see the space shuttle. Let's go." And I said, "Oh, I can't leave my students here. They're taking a final exam." He said, "Oh, they won't care. Besides, this will only take about 20 minutes. And I explained to him that I couldn't leave my students, that I had an obligation to stay with them while they were taking the exam. Well, he argued with me. He kept trying to tell me that there was nothing wrong with my leaving my students, and how he really wanted me to see the Endeavour, and how it wouldn't take very long. And I could tell that he was agitated. He kept wringing his hands and shifting from one side to the other. And I could tell that he was extremely upset that I wouldn't go with him to see the shuttle.
So going to see the shuttle was obviously a cover for something else. She possibly might have been abducted there again, questioned as to her interactions with aliens, or possibly a fake alien abduction might have occurred right there. I'm only speculating.
I didn't, nevertheless. And I went back home, got off the base okay. The next day, though, there was an article in our local newspaper that said that armed guards were stationed around the shuttle with authorization to use deadly force. And I earnestly believe that that deadly force was meant for me, that I was supposed to have gone out to the shuttle, I was supposed to have gotten extremely close to it, I was supposed to have taken pictures, and I was supposed to have been killed.
Not sure if I agree with that, but I can understand her paranoia, however.
My curiosity far outweighed my fear. Have asked me, why do you feel that you've undergone harassment? Why do you feel that the military and government have singled you out like this? A lot of researchers and abductees say that they have not encountered military government harassment in their cases or in other cases. So why have I? Well, one possible explanation is that I was involved in a crash of a spaceship. I remember being aboard a craft, aboard a spaceship, and I remember looking out the porthole onto the ocean below. I'm not 100% positive where this took place, but I have an idea. Anyway, I was looking out the porthole, and I saw a military ship on the ocean below, and while I was looking at it, I felt a jolt, and I remember falling backwards and hitting my head on something. And the next thing I recall was waking up and walking out an opening of the craft onto a beach, sandy area. And I remember hearing airplanes and helicopters overhead. And I remembered seeing a man with an alien creature over his shoulder. I remembered seeing a lifeboat approach the shore and two men motioned for me to come aboard that lifeboat. Before that happened, I remembered when I walked out onto the beach toward the water, I remember somebody yelling at me to stay where I was. Somebody said, "Stay right there, don't move." The sound sounded amplified to me. I don't know now if it was because my head was hurting so bad, feeling as if it were going to explode, or if there was some kind of megaphone or something like that amplifying the sound. I remember getting into the lifeboat, not struggling, but going with two men in the lifeboat out to the big military ship. And I remember hearing helicopters overhead as I was going out onto the ocean. And once I climbed up into the ship, climbed up a ladder onto the ship, and once I got on deck, I remember a man in uniform helping me onto the deck. And once I got up there, I saw one alien still alive lying on the deck of the ship. I don't know whether this was the same alien that I saw earlier on the beach or not, but there are several aliens that are unaccounted for in my mind. I don't know what happened to them. I know that there were at least 4 aliens aboard the craft with me, and I saw 1 or 2 after the crash. I don't know what happened to the others.
So it sounds like the military shot down UAP that Leah Haley had been inside of. That's what that sounds like to me. Some sort of a weapon was used on that craft, and it was shot down.
I remembered wanting to help this entity that was still alive, and 2 men grabbed me and took me down some stairs onto a lower deck of the ship. And the last thing I remember was sitting down on the bottom stair, and my head felt so heavy and hurt so badly. I felt it was going to explode, and I felt like I was going to pass out. And the last thing I remember was sitting down on the stair and putting my head in my lap, and I don't remember anything else. Another memory I have is of 2 men escorting me from a military plane into a car and taking me back to a motel where I was staying and holding me. One man held me at gunpoint while the other one went to a desk to get a key to my room. And I remember being kept out in the hallway at gunpoint by one man while the other one went inside my room where my husband was supposed to be sleeping. I assume that that's how I got back from the crash site, although there's a big gap in memory. In September of 1992, I decided to try to find the crash site where it possibly occurred. I think it's possible that it occurred in the Gulf Breeze area around Navarre Beach. I'm not positive.
Now, this is significant. She actually went out and tried to find the location of where this craft that she was in was shot down by the military. You don't hear that very often, where somebody goes out and tries to find physical evidence of a location where an alien-related event occurred.
I have reason to believe that's where it took place, but I can't be sure. I do know that the area down there is consistent with what I remembered in my hypnosis session. Anyway, I decided to walk one day from Navarre Beach to Fort Walton Beach to see if the area did look consistent with the crash site, and it did. And that portion of beach where I walked is right at the border of Eglin Air Force Base. About halfway through my walk, I saw some equipment that has since been confirmed as being an electromagnetic pulse device. Some of the researchers who worked on my case believe that this electromagnetic pulse device was responsible for downing the craft that I was in when the crash occurred. I've experienced what I consider some extreme forms of harassment by military government officials. At least I believe they're military and government officials. I can't prove it. For instance, I had an encounter one night. I was abducted by the chalky-colored creatures, and their normal medical experiments were performed on me. But they didn't bring me all the way home that night. Instead, what they did was drop me off in a field near my home. I remember being somewhat programmed. I felt as if I were in some kind of a zombie state, and I remember thinking to myself as I was looking up into the sky, I've got to get back home. I've got to get back home. And while I was standing out in the field thinking about that, as if I were programmed, a helicopter landed in front of me. And so a bunch of men in wearing green fatigues and carrying big black machine guns jumped out of the helicopter and came up to me and grabbed me. And I started yelling expletives at them as soon as I realized what was going on, and struggled with them, but to no avail. And they dragged me into the helicopter, and as I approached the helicopter, I saw a man wearing Air Force Blue uniform. He seemed to be the one in charge of the situation. I remember him telling me that I was a troublemaker and they were going to have to shut me up. And this was about the point in time that I had decided I was going to undergo hypnotic regression to recover my memories. Anyway, I was taken aboard the helicopter. It seemed that we flew a short distance, and the helicopter landed near a building that had restricted on the door. And I was shoved inside, and as soon as I got inside the door, the man in the Air Force Blue uniform said to a group of men who were apparently waiting for me to arrive, "Here she is. She's a cocky little bitch." And there was a man in a khaki uniform standing at the opposite side of the room, and he looked at me coldly and said, "Well, we'll just take care of that." And they did. The next thing I remembered was someone giving me a shot in my right arm, and I remembered becoming very dizzy and feeling as if I were going to pass out. I remember being shoved into a chair, and I remember asking the man in the khaki uniform what they wanted with me, what I was doing there, what they wanted, and he told me, quoting, "It's none of your damn business, just shut up and listen." I told him I wasn't ready to listen, that I wanted an explanation for why I was there, and I didn't get one. He told me, I just remember him telling me that I had not seen a spaceship. He kept telling me over and over again, "You did not see a spaceship. Do you understand? You did not see a spaceship." And I argued with him. I said, "I know what I saw. What are you trying to cover up?" And again, he said, "It's none of your damn business." Interestingly, he didn't say we're not trying to cover up anything. He just told me it was none of my business. I don't remember much after that. I remember getting very dizzy, very weak, putting my head down, and I remember at one point being put on a stretcher, being put in the back of a truck, and I had my eyes closed, and I heard one man say to another, "How are we going to handle this?" And I heard another man reply, "I don't know, this is a tough one." When I remembered this encounter, I was very upset. I felt that my rights had been violated. I was very upset at being drugged against my will, being taken off to a base and questioned and being brainwashed and not remembering everything that happened to me. And I felt that I had a right to know what was going on, and yet I was given no information. That's only one incident that I've had with apparent military government people. I remembered being in what I believed to be a military hospital. Again, I saw men in uniform and men in white lab coats. I recall being given shots. I remember being strapped down. I remember being given shock treatment. And again, I was told that I had caused these people trouble. I don't know what kind of trouble I've caused, so I'm exasperated about not knowing what they're talking about. They've wiped too much memory from my mind. I've also recalled these apparent military government people in this military hospital. I've also recalled them using an X-ray to X-ray my body. And I remember being in some kind of transparent container. I don't know what they were doing with me there or what was happening to me. I do know that my ear hurt when I was in this facility, my right ear, the one that I had recalled the aliens messing with earlier. And I do know that after this encounter, I no longer heard some Morse code type beeps in my right ear that I had been hearing previously. I assume that these individuals removed something from my ear that had been causing tones, but I'm not sure. I don't know for sure.
That sounds like an RFID chip or radio frequency ID chip that had been implanted in her ear and then removed by the military.
Certain that's what happened. I also recall receiving shock treatment when I was in a hillside facility with a tiny little entity about the height of the knees of man, and the man in green fatigues was standing there questioning him. I remember getting shock treatment then and being asked what happens when you're on board spacecraft. I've remembered seeing various types of entities. One type is what I call chalky colored creatures. These are the ones who performed the medical experiments on me. They are between 4 and 5 feet tall. They have big black almond-shaped eyes, no whites, no pupils.
I don't know whether you can see this, but she's holding up her book there.
They have 4 fingers. I don't remember what their feet look like.
That's The Lost Key, her book.
I don't recall ever seeing any ears, no hair, 2 little holes for a nose.
Lost as the Key, her book.
They move so gracefully, extremely gracefully, and they talk, they communicate.
The aerial school kids that John Mack interviewed also said that the aliens moved very gracefully. That's interesting.
Telepathically through the eyes. I've also seen a creature that I call the reptilian. I remember encountering that creature only one time. It was a rape encounter. This creature was the ugliest creature I could ever imagine seeing. He had scaly skin and long claws. His head reminded me of a snake's head in its shape. He had long pointed ears. He was probably around 5.5 feet tall. Had kind of tan or brownish skin, and it looked like protrusions, sort of, up here in the chest area, although my memory is quite vague. In that encounter, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I didn't have any feeling, and I don't remember too much about that encounter other than what I'm reporting now. Beginning in May 1991, I started receiving telepathic communications from some unknown source. The first time I received any communication of this sort was after one of my hypnosis sessions, where I remembered being interrogated in a conference room on base. And the telepathic communication I received that time was in the form of symbols. The symbols seemed to be religious symbols, but I was extremely confused.
These are some of the symbols that you see on the screen coming across Leah Haley now that she mentioned that she was telepathically seeing.
After I saw these symbols in my head, it was, to describe it is very difficult, but the best way I can explain it is by saying if a person imagines just scrolling down a computer screen and seeing one symbol on each screen, that's what I saw, but in my head, in my mind. Nothing had ever happened to me like that before. It happened after I prayed. After my hypnosis session, I was so upset. I didn't understand what was going on as far as the alien phenomenon was concerned. I didn't understand why our military and government were trying to cover it up, and I certainly didn't understand why I was caught in the middle. It was before I remembered being involved in the crash, and so I didn't know at that point in time why I might be singled out by military and government officials. So I was extremely upset, and I was praying to God to give me answers to these questions that I had. And I was begging for God to help me understand what was going on. You know, why were these aliens interested in me? Why were the military and government officials interested in me? And what was happening? What did the phenomenon mean? And I was begging for answers. And that's when I first saw symbols scrolling through my head. I don't understand what they mean. Even to this day, I don't know what they mean, but they did give me a source of comfort, and I was able to go to sleep. So some of my telepathic communications have come in the form of symbols.
It's interesting because I did a podcast before this one on Jim Sparks, who had 95% conscious recall of his abductions. And he said that the aliens also communicated in symbols, and he was taught these symbols, just as Leah Haley mentioned the symbols as well.
There was another time that I had a dream of symbols, but again, I don't remember what the symbols meant or why they were in my head. I've also received verbal telepathic communications, although not audible. I don't hear a voice. I call the communications the silent voice because I don't really hear anything. I just have instant knowledge in my head. I was also given a telepathic message to write a children's book about an abduction. One night, about 11:30 p.m., I was just brushing my teeth, minding my own business, not even thinking about the UFO phenomenon. And the silent voice told me to take an encounter I had when I was 3 years old and write it into a story in the form of a children's book for preschoolers so that children who are being abducted would not be so afraid. I was told that the story was to be written to help alleviate the fear of young children who are being abducted. So I think all in all, the telepathic communications I've received have benefited me. I don't see that they've harmed me in any way, at least so far. I don't know whether what I'm told is true or not. I don't know whether where these messages are coming from. When I receive these messages, I don't see anything. So I don't know whether or not these messages can be trusted. I just feel that they're important enough to discuss and let whoever hears them make up his or her own mind about what to think of them. After I realized I was being followed by apparent military government people, and after I was taken to a base and interrogated and given shock treatment and drugged up by these apparent military and government officials, again, I was just horribly filled with anger. I felt betrayed by our military and government. I felt that my rights had been violated. I felt that all my privacy had been stripped away. I felt like a little hunted animal that couldn't escape. And I was filled with fear that I was going to be killed. And recently, I I remember being deprogrammed by paramilitary government officials, having my memory erased. Many people ask me what my opinion is of what's going on here. You know, what's this phenomenon all about? And of course, I don't have the answer to that question. I wish I did. Right now, based on my own experiences, my own encounters, the telepathic messages I've received, military government harassment, my opinion at present is that there's a struggle going on between good and evil, and we're caught up in the middle of it. I've heard so many abductees talk about their encounters that seem to have a negative slant, and others seem to have a positive slant. And I believe that we're caught up in a war between maybe dark forces and light forces, good and evil, whatever we want to call it. But until I get further evidence, that's what I tend to believe. And the one thing that I request, you know, it really doesn't matter to me whether someone believes me or not. It doesn't matter to me. All I ask is that everyone keep an open mind.
Okay, so I know that was rather long, but I thought that it would be a lot easier to show you Leah Haley for herself, and you guys judge how believable she is. I also thought that it'd be interesting to show her story as a follow-up to my last podcast, which contrasted John Mack abductions to Dr. Stephen Greer abductions. And the Stephen Greer abductions, he says that the military is involved and responsible for abductions. And John Mack, he's more involved, or was more involved with just documenting and clinically studying the reports from abductees. Now, in Leah Haley's case, it sounds as though both the military and the aliens are involved in the abductions. And certainly you would expect that the military would be kinder, more positive towards an abductee, but it just didn't seem to be the case in Leah Haley's case. They were rather brusque with her, and she said herself that they violated her civil rights. It's interesting that Leah Haley maintains positive attitude and trying to rise above everything. And her opinion is that somehow there's a power struggle between negative and positive forces. I'd like to show Leah Haley's books. This is cover of Leah Haley's book, Lost Was the Key. There are other versions as well. This is another cover to Leah A. Haley's book, Lost Was the Key. And this is her last book, written in 2021, Unlocking Alien Closets. It's unlike any other abduction account. She claims to have been abducted by multiple times since childhood. Smallish, chalky-colored beings abducted her, examined her physically on a number of occasions, and removed eggs from her ovaries, ostensibly for the creation of hybrid children. Aliens have inserted implants into her body, and she has discovered physical marks on her person that coincide with her experiences. So there's physical evidence as well. She has interacted with more than one type of alien, including a reptilian or race of beings. If you recall, she mentioned being raped by a reptilian. What is most important about her experiences, though, is her reported harassment at the hands of military and government agents on Earth. She claims to have been abducted several times by such human agents who drugged and interrogated her to get information about aliens. Why the military should be so interested in her experience she says that she was inside a spaceship that crash landed after having been shot down by the U.S. Air Force. Her hypnotic regression sessions were handled by John Carpenter, who is well respected in the ufology community. Her writing is not polished. It most definitely reads as her own personal effort to describe the things she has remembered and learned in her own way. It is in no way a slick presentation targeted at the reader. It is her reported encounters with the human government agents. The personal trauma and excessive harassment she claims to have suffered at the hands is, if true, exceedingly grievous. So Leah Haley makes a lot of claims, so it's easy to be skeptical. What's important is her account of the harassment that she received at the hands of government agents. And obviously, this came as a result of the crashed spaceship that she had been abducted and was inside of. And I guess they wanted information about the aliens and the spaceship as a result. I just thought that her case was unique, and I usually don't buy into testimony of abductees as a result of hypnotic regression. But there was evidence there in the video that she comes across as very honest and forthcoming. I hope this wasn't too long. I felt that the need to actually show the actual entirety of the interview practically. My name is Al Barrows. This has been UFO Disclosure. My website is ufo-disclosure.com. My Instagram is UFO Disclosure Podcast. My Twitter is @UFO Disclosure with an underscore at the end. And my YouTube channel is @UFO Disclosure, B as in Bravo, R as in Romeo, 3YY. And don't forget to contact your senator or reps over in Washington. Let them know that you're interested in disclosure, continuing, and more transparency from the government. And you can do that by going to newparadigmproject.org. It's real easy to do. You just click a couple of icons and you're done. All my love and good intentions go out to all, especially those in Gaza and the Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. Also, please take care of all the children out there that really need your love and attention. I'm manifesting a protective shield around all the lonely and scared kids out there that need help.
في واحد قاعد ينادي على ابوي قاعد يقول له وقاعد يقول له اطلع هذا وقاعد ينادي عليه اخلو اخلو احنا فجأة مسكنا اغراضنا وطلعنا.
انت ايش اسمك؟
شام.
وين احنا سكان وين انت؟
المغازي.
ليش خايفة؟
يا اخي مسكين لاي حدا ما تلاقيش هينا هنا.
ليش خايفة يا عم يا حبيبي؟
أنا كنت أستنى حتى تخلص عشان ابني مسافرة وأستناها تيجي.
إن شاء الله بتخلص الحرب وبتشوفي أمك تعيطيش. شكرا.
Thanks again, and blessings to all.